It's such a pleasure to have Charlotte Smith here today.
Lovely to be here. And it's fun for me to actually see a fashion school put in such a splendid building too, instead of it being like a school building. So it's really fun to be here, and I don't know Glebe at all, so it's an adventure today.
I hope you like our furniture.
I do. It's wonderful. Yeah, it's
shop,
fantastic.
Particularly downstairs.
Yeah, oh, it's beautiful. It's a really
pieces.
nice space. Yeah, it's a great space.
Thank you very much. Tell us about your story and how your godmother left you that fabulous collection.
Well, I always say that the collection arrived totally out of the blue. I grew up with my godmother, so I knew about her collection, and I would always dress up when, we'd go visit her in Philadelphia on the east coast of America. And Doris, it was always this incredibly kind of exotic visit when I go see her, because she lived in a historic house in Philadelphia where they had cobblestone streets. And the house was a Federation-style house made of brick, but it's very tall and very slender. It was like a row of townhouses. And whenever I'd arrive, she would always take me up these very narrow stairs up to the 3rd floor. And on the 3rd floor was where she kept her collection when it was in its early days. And there would be sort of stacks of trunks filled with gloves and hats and shoes and small things. And then she'd have a few mannequins dressed. And then she'd have wardrobes where you'd slide back the glass paneling, and there would be these fabulous, sequin dresses and dresses with feathers and dresses with color and ball gowns coming out. So as a young girl, it was pretty amazing to be part of this. And she'd always dress me up in something kind of cute. But my godmother wore them and wore a lot of the clothing. And for her, it was about keeping someone's story alive. So she was as fascinated about the clothing and loved the clothing, her collection for the clothing, as much as she did the stories behind it. So, when I inherited the collection, I realized very quickly, very soon into going through all the boxes, that what I was inheriting was a collection recording social history and women's history through fashion. So I'm not that interested in the whole fashion side of it. I love fashion and I love dating things, but for me it's really looking at it from that kind of archival, that historical, the storytelling point of view of it. So, but anyway, back to Doris's story. So, I grew up with knowing about Doris's collection, never anticipating that I would inherit it. And it was when I'd already moved out here to Australia that I heard through the grapevine that Doris was thinking of leaving the collection to me. And I remember my first thought was like, what on earth am I going to do with it? And then it arrived, and about 6 months later it arrived, and it was something like, I don't know, it was like massive, 1,200 kilos of clothing that we ended up having to fly in, not ship it in, which would have been the cheaper option, because if it came by ship in a container, it was going to have to be fumigated, and of course chemicals obviously isn't going to work, so we had to fly it in. And then it took quarantine 10 days to go through the boxes, because there were grizzly bear fur muffs, there were ivory fans, there were whole birds of paradise that an Edwardian lady would have put on her hat. I mean, everything that is a huge no-no for quarantine here in Australia. But because it was historic, 100 years or older, antique, 100 years or older, and it was in really good condition, it all passed through. So then it arrived, and I started going through the boxes and just finding extraordinary pieces. I mean, I knew that I was looking at like a 1920s dance dress, or I knew that I was looking at a Victorian dress that had all the boning in it, or there were some beautiful Dior dresses that I pulled out of boxes. So in the end, it was about 3,500 pieces that arrived, and it took me about 3 months to unpack.
Why did Doris keep all this merchandise? What was her story and her passion?
Well, for Doris, she worked as a librarian, and so I think she's always been interested in archiving stories and keeping things in a timeline order. So that was where her interest, that was where her career lay. And for her, it was about treasuring other people's stories, because what she would do is that she'd wear something fabulous, maybe that her mother had worn or her grandmother had worn, so she'd wear it. And this is back at a time when people aren't wearing vintage clothing because it's cool and trendy. it was a bit bizarre, because back then, if you wore someone else's clothes, it usually meant in, you know, early 1940s, 30s and 40s that you couldn't afford to buy your own clothing.
Yeah.
So it didn't have the cachet that it has now. But she loved it because someone would say, "Oh my gosh, I love that hat with a feather in it." And she'd say, "Well, it belonged to my great aunt, whoever." And so when people saw her wearing it, they say, "Well, I'm going to give you the one that we've had, you know, sitting in a wardrobe for years." So for her, it was people were gifting her things, and they were gifting it because they treasured that piece. And when she accepted that gift of clothing or an accessory, she asked for a story. So it was a story about maybe when the piece was worn. It could have been a story about the family. It could have been a story about the decade. So it was constantly about stories related to the actual garment or the dress.
Fabulous. So tell me, how do you feel about the collection now?
Well, the collection now has gone from being something that my godmother considered a hobby. So she just collected it, and she did like her fashion parades, but in a low-key way in this beautiful building in Philadelphia, just reminiscing about stories. So it went from that to then arriving here in Australia, where nobody had ever heard of it before. I mean, nobody inherits a clothing collection, so that was a bit quirky. And the fact that it was predominantly American French with some Italian, some English, dating from the late 1700s to 1960. But because it had no Australian element, people weren't that interested in it initially. And so for the last 17 years, I've built the collection up. At one stage, it was 9,000 pieces through gifts and donations and pieces that I purchased. But I've built up the Australian element now so that it's probably about maybe over 1,000 pieces. No, maybe less than that. It probably, before I had my deacquisition sale, a deaccession sale, it would have been over 1,000 pieces. They're probably about 500 or 600 now. And the collection goes from Doris's original piece, late 1700s, all the way up to yesterday off the catwalk. So I look at it now as it's not like a cute, cozy little collection that you think, oh, what am I going to wear today? And you go and find it. This is a working, professional, museum quality collection that has to be stored in climate controlled facilities. Every time you work with it, it has to be done with very strict rules about how you handle clothing. So it's a job, it's a career. A job doesn't sound very romantic, but it's a career. And you know, it's something that I've totally created out of nothing, which I'm really sort of proud of, in a way that it went from being a collection that people thought, like I did, what are you going to do with it, to being something now that, before COVID, I was able to travel the world with it.
Do you think that it gets the recognition that it deserves?
It does. I mean, the people who need to know about my collection. I work with all different types of people, from retail to people like Gerber Technology in America. I've worked with them, done a big project with them and turned into a catwalk parade. I've done television, I've written 3 books, I'm a speaker, I'm a master of sound. So the collection has, even if the collection isn't as respected as it should be, I certainly have been given a platform that, through my collection, where I then can talk about the history of fashion, which to me is, even more important than your collection. It's my collection. It's about, being able to talk about fashion history, women's history, manufacturers, designers, things like that, and try to raise the word fashion from a small F for fashion to capital F for fashion, and giving it a much higher prominence.
Are there a couple of iconic pieces that you adore in the collection?
I do. I mean, I sold one piece at auction because it didn't really fit in to my collection. My collection is mostly glamour dresses, gowns, really special occasion clothing. And I bought, actually, at Shapiro's auctions here in Sydney, I bought this fantastic Vivienne Westwood. So even though it's sold, it's still an iconic piece for me. So I sold this thing, and it was from her 1983 collection, which was looking at the history of Englishness and she turned it into a fashion collection. So it was looking at, the piece that I have was all about deer stalkers and hunting that you'd find in northern England and into Scotland. And it was Harris tweed, so it was a grey plaid tweed, and it was a pair of like knickerbockers that came down here, and then a vest. And instead of it being like a Sherlock Holmes deerstalker hat on your head, she'd put it on like your shoulders, and it could be worn by a man or a woman. And so I bought it for not very much money. I bought it for just over $1,000, I think. This was quite a few years ago now, and I sold it for $15,000.
Wow.
And it's gone into a major museum in England. And for me, that's fantastic that. The piece had an Australian story. The woman who sold it used to live behind the Vivienne Westwood World's End boutique when it was in, on King's Road or wherever it was. And so she bought her pieces all the time. So it had that Australian association. And I never like selling anything, but there are times when bills need to be paid that are beyond, or I need to buy something else. So I decided to sell that one. So that was sort of an iconic one for it. And then another one would be, I really like the Belle Epoque era, that sort of 1900s to about 1915, 1917. Because to me it was a really important time for women who were emerging into the independent women that we have now become because of these women who were, the suffragette movement of course began then, and for the clothing it was very lavish, and I have many pieces in the collection including this one beautiful lime green kind of silk brocade striped dress with a very long train, and this beautiful kind of silk, what do you call it? It's like a mousseline kind of a fabric that is bubbly. It's like a waffle weave on it. It's extraordinary. And then it's got this little cute little vest that goes over it. And then it's got two little bumblebees that are brooches that you can attach and move over in a high neck. And I love it because it's so, the attention to detail is so extraordinary that it's of a time and an era when they had the money and the time to do things like that. And to me, it's, it's a moment where instead of having that big cumbersome bustle behind you, she would have been wearing a very tight boned waist cincher so that it would have cinched her waist in. And then they called it the mono bosom. So it was like, instead of your, breasts being separated in two, of course, it's just one puffy bosom that comes out like that. And then this wonderful train. So you have that kind of, S shape. And to me, again, it's that, it's moving women out of their very cumbersome, dangerous clothing into things that eventually move into the sheep-shaped dresses, of course, from the 1920s. So that to me is an iconic period, iconic dress for the period, and I do love that era. I think it's incredible.
So how does your love of antiques compare to your love of fashion?
Well, they're actually quite similar. I mean, they definitely blend. And I was actually asked, I did an online course for an American university the other day, and someone asked me about, she wants to be a fashion historian, which I was very impressed about, And she said, what advice can you give me? And I think this kind of segues into this idea of antiques and clothing, vintage collection. Is that, I said, for someone like me I'm a fashion historian versus a fashion designer, I'm kind of a curator versus a stylist. I think when you kind of immerse yourself in the world of that decade or of that century is going to make you appreciate the clothing far better. So knowing that a woman in 1900 in her beautiful gown with a long train, she was going to be sitting in a chair, maybe from a decade before, but in a certain chair. The architecture was going to be similarly, you think of Gallet and some of the the French furniture and architects. So what food would she have been eating? What jewelry was she wearing? What paintings would have been on the wall? So to me, it's about, the antiques to me has given me a far richer way of looking at not only collecting, but also appreciating the clothing in the context in which they were worn.
Yeah, fabulous. What is the future for your collection? What is that?
Well, there is some very, very big news about to happen, but I can't tell you. It's a secret for the moment. It's totally, yeah. But there is some big news happening. So that's all I can say. But, you know, I'm very happy, as you can see. It's like my ultimate dream, and, you know, the vision of where the vision I've always had for the collection. So that's for the collection for me. Once the announcement's made, I wish I could announce it here first, but
Can I ask you one question? Will Australians have exposure to?
Yes. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
So
what we need to know.
yeah. So for me, you know, my next step is I don't know. I definitely want to keep collecting, but I want to keep collecting with a multicultural emphasis, because I find multiculturalism in fashion fascinating, and it's, you know, we've already, sustainability is kind of happening and all that sort of stuff, and, you know, other things, but for me multiculturalism is really important because I can go all the way back to, you know, centuries ago, as well as looking at what designers even at FBI might be studying. So to me that's really important, and to see that, you know, we live now with so many different nationalities around us, so many different religions, different ages, and I think fashion is going to be the most the clearest and the most unique way of expressing who we are, and also telling other people who we are through, you know, whether it's motifs, colors, shapes, styles, whatever. So that's where I'm going with my collecting. And for me too, I do a lot of you know, speaking. I'd like to write another book, you know, so I've got lots of plans, but it's all centered around being, you know, the custodian of this extraordinary collection.
Thank you so much, Charlotte.
Thank you.
That was extraordinary, as you are.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's always fun. I love sharing the story, because it's not always about fashion and being a designer. There's so many elements of fashion, the fashion world, that I think are really important to share with people, so that people realize that if one isn't quite to their suiting, there are so many other options.
Exactly.
So
Thank you very much.